Season 1, Episode 6, Heart Monitor, opens on an unassuming Scott coming home after a grocery run. Before he can get to his car, he's attacked. Surprisingly, by Derek. Turns out it was a training session, a way for Derek to teach Scott how to use his reflexes and hone his werewolf abilities. Scott is overwhelmed. This kind of life-threatening situation is not something he or any teenager is built for, and Derek doesn't seem to care for how it's affecting him psychologically. Scott blames himself for the incident with the mountain lion the other night and believes he is the reason that the sheriff got hurt. To be clear, Scott is not at fault. The sheriff was hit by a car driven by a panicked civilian trying to get out of the parking lot. To him, the mountain lion is a consequence of him shirking his responsibilities. Derek reveals that he was born a werewolf, whereas Scott was only bitten, so he doesn't know how to teach Scott what he's known since birth. What he does know is anger. Derek tells Scott that the only way to control his abilities is to get angry, and use that to fuel him. And Allison, as Derek echoes what I pointed out about Stiles' growing resentment in the last episode, is a distraction. Knowing that Derek was born into this life gives much needed context to his perspective. The Hale House fire marked not just the loss of his family, but the loss of his culture, and now he has to figure out how to pass on this culture to someone who would rather be doing anything else. That's why Derek cares so much about rituals, markings, and rites of passage. It also complicates Scott's journey. We've talked about how Scott's incident in the first episode is akin to assault, which means that most of his story in the first season is learning how to accept and move forward with this new reality instead of avoiding it. Derek was not bitten, and his identity as a werewolf is a point of pride.
You've been given something that most people would kill for. The bite is a gift.
I don't want it.
This doesn't change my reading of Scott's arc, but these two perspectives help explain why Scott and Derek don't get along. Scott does not keep his promise to stay away from Allison, but hides just before Kate walks in on them. Allison is clearly still upset at her father for gunning down a mountain lion in the middle of a school, and she says this, which I found interesting.
I'm not gonna be one of those whining teenagers who looks at her father and says, I hate you, I wish you were dead. But I hate him and I wish he was dead.
We've spoken on and off about Allison's relationship to her identity, or lack thereof, and how she seems singularly focused to be, quote, not like other girls. A friend of mine pointed out that this line supports what I said in episode 3, Pack Mentality, and episode 4, Magic Bullet. Essentially, Allison is so focused on who she doesn't want to be that she barely understands who she wants to be, and who she actually is. I'd argue that this puts her in a vulnerable position, because she feels more in control of her identity than she actually is. And that means when things come crashing down, she won't have a solid foundation to rely on. She'll have trouble standing up for herself or recognizing when people are working against her. Allison lies about a family history project, but Kate takes the opportunity to introduce her to a very old story about the Beast of Gévaudan. The Beast of Gévaudan is a French legend about a beast that killed hundreds of men, women, and children. This is a real piece of history that took place in the 18th century. Many people think the beast was a large wolf-like creature, though it was likely due to packs of wolves which were known to roam in France back then. This is a clever way to tie real history in with the show's lore, and it isn't the only time we'll see this happen. The point here is that Kate, in some way, is trying to expose Allison to the supernatural. It follows her hints in the previous episode when she gifted Allison a family-owned necklace. As Scott heads home, the Alpha pays a visit and traces a spiral on his car window. Derek has been chillin' in Scott's house this whole time and seems genuinely startled by this information.
Yeah, we had a nice conversation about the weather. No, he didn't talk.
No spoilers yet, but this is the same spiral that we saw on the roof, and the same spiral that we saw around Laura Hale's grave. And if you ask me, it looks pretty similar to the tattoo on Derek's back. Scott also sensed that the Alpha was angry, drawing a connection to the conversation him and Derek had about anger just 10 minutes ago. This lovely little practical transition takes us to the next day, where Scott tries his best to stay away from Allison. Stiles is still angry at Scott, both because Scott had been ignoring him all day in the previous episode, and because that inadvertently led to his dad getting hurt. Again, it's not really Scott's fault, but Stiles' growing resentment is naturally going to blame Scott because, theoretically, his superpowered best friend would have been able to do something if he had just showed up. Not pleased that Scott went to Derek for help, Stiles takes it upon himself to teach Scott how to control his shift, despite having no credentials or experience. That's the assumption of Scott's response versus Stiles' hypothetical own response showing out again. But he brings up a good point that's been introduced in this episode. The only way Derek knows how to control his his shift is through anger, and Scott's anger has resulted in out-of-control shifts that almost get people hurt. Allison, who's been thrilled by her recent family history, relays the news to Lydia.
Your ancestors killed a big wolf. So what?
Plus, Lydia's not so thrilled when the image of the beast triggers memories of her own encounter from the previous episode. While Scott hides from Allison, him and Stiles continue to rib each other.
Yeah, you be my Yoda.
You're Yoda, I will be.
I said it backwards.
Yeah,
I know.
All right, you know what? I definitely still hate you.
And Stiles is gaining a sense of superiority over his new role in teaching Scott.
But your crap has infiltrated my life, so now I have to do something about it.
Let me in, Scott. I can help. No.
Even though, again, we know that's just a projection of how Stiles sees himself opposite Scott. After another narrow encounter with Allison, Scott and Stiles take to the lacrosse field to test out a new theory. Whenever Scott shifts, his heart rate goes up, and it's tied to whatever anger or emotions he's feeling in that moment. So, if Scott can learn to control his heart rate, then maybe that will control his anger and therefore his shift. It's the kind of hypothesis that highlights Stiles' real value. He's not the nerdy sidekick, rather he's someone who can make connections between seemingly unrelated things, to draw conclusions where no one else can. That's why he gets distracted by small details, the wolfsbane, Laura shifting into a full wolf, and can spend hours getting lost in a case like the Hale House fire. Scott and Stiles test out their theory in a messy way. Stiles throws the crossballs at Scott in order to intentionally raise his heart rate, and it doesn't hurt that he gets to work out his anger with Scott too. As Jackson snoops nearby, Scott gets so angry that he almost shifts, but is able to stop himself in time. Unfortunately, Derek's advice is proven correct. Scott's strength is correlated with his anger, and he concludes that being around Allison is dangerous.
Just because she makes you happy?
No, because she makes me weak. You know, this whole women make you weak thing is a little too Spartan warrior for me.
Stiles points out that staying away from Allison probably won't be forever. It's just a part of the learning process. But Scott isn't just afraid of losing Allison, he's afraid that he'll have to be alone for the rest of his life and uses Derek as that example. This falls neatly in line with the reflection theory I proposed in episode 3, Pack Mentality. Derek's character in some ways represents an alternate version of Scott, who he might have been under different circumstances. And this realization cages Scott in. But Stiles, though frustrated, is still on Scott's side and repeats what he's been saying since day one.
All right, you're not gonna end up like Derek. All right, we'll figure it out.
Jackson, meanwhile, is not healing. The scratchers from Derek's claws seem to be affecting him psychologically, causing horrific hallucinations. Is he just experiencing a very slow transformation into a werewolf? We don't know. This won't stop him from his bigger goal, which is to find out what Scott is hiding. And if he can't get close to Scott, then Allison is his next best bet. And this scene is so delightfully creepy. From the shots pushing in to the sparse music, Jackson is trying to get closer to Allison. And in apologizing, he actually gets some pushback from Allison.
I'm serious.
Okay, I believe you're being serious, but I'm not so sure I believe you're being sincere.
Over the course of this conversation, Allison is both scared of and intrigued by Jackson. This is a loose connection to what I said about Allison earlier, that she is more likely to be deceived or manipulated because she doesn't have a strong sense of self-identity. It's why she starts to feel bad for Jackson and later on becomes closer to him. And Jackson's argument gives me manifest destiny. He was the star player, this life was precious for him, and now Scott has perhaps undeservedly taken that away from him.
Haven't you ever learned there's no I in team?
Yeah, but there is a me.
The racist undertones are definitely there. But I think the scene itself is so expertly done, down to this shift in movement that just heightens the tension and fear that Allison feels. But back to Scott. Allison starts to feel insecure that Scott is avoiding her, though she doesn't know that it's technically for her own good. Unexpectedly, Coach rips into Scott in front of his classmates, raising his heart rate, and we all fear he's about to shift. But something holds him back, and Stiles connects the dots.
It's her. What do you mean? It's Allison.
Stiles describes Allison as Scott's anchor.
I don't think she makes you weak. I think she actually gives you control. She's kind of like an anchor.
And this goes directly against what Derek said, right? He said Allison is a distraction because she prevents Scott from getting angry and using that emotion to control his shift. But for Scott, anger doesn't fuel him, it makes him lose control, and it's his relationships with others that ground him instead. This further confirms Scott as a reflection of Derek. His anger is probably the only emotion he has left. But Scott still has a chance. He has people willing to look out for him. So Scott doesn't need to turn to anger to get through this. Also, Scott realizes he's in love with Allison after dating her for like 2 weeks at most. The problem, of course, is that Allison is not always going to be by Scott's side, so Stiles tests out another theory, and let's just get through this. Stiles puts Scott in a situation where some grown men start beating him up, and while Stiles knows that Scott will heal, Scott is forced to rely on Allison's presence however many miles away in order to control his heart rate. So this is the third time that someone has to hurt Scott in order to train him. The first one was with Derek, who will terrorize him at any chance he can get, and the following are because of Stiles. And we know that Stiles is partly also quote-unquote punishing Scott. He's taking out his anger on Scott for the events of the previous episode, which means that the only people who know Scott's secret kind of take pride in hurting him. That's a little messed up. I can understand Derek's perspective because his unchecked aggression is a part of his character, and I can understand Stiles if his unchecked aggression is a genuine character flaw, something that the show engages with and uses to create a more complex character. I'm just gonna go ahead and say that this is, as far as I remember, not the case. So while these scenes on their own are just meant to serve the plot at that time, I struggle to watch them without remembering the context of how the show plays out. Ultimately, I think it's hypocritical that Scott is responsible for controlling his anger, but Stiles doesn't have that same responsibility. Beyond that, the expectation for Scott to accept this kind of physical abuse without a real reckoning with the effect that might have on him, and why he might be so willing to accept that pain, is also a huge problem. And a problem I have with the chosen one trope overall. But I'm really getting ahead of myself, and there's plenty more time to address this topic. While Scott and Stiles are sent to detention, Derek is visiting Peter. This scene, in my opinion, is a really good summary of the weight on Derek's shoulders. He's pleading with his catatonic uncle to help him figure out who killed Laura, who the Alpha might be, and Derek is resolute that he can and has to take out the Alpha himself.
I can take him.
This continues to explain why Derek is so harsh to Scott, why he insists on Scott's help. There's a lot of tragedy surrounding this guy, and he wants justice.
I didn't kill him. Neither of us did. It's not your fault and it's not mine.
But I think the most interesting reveal is that Derek believes that the Alpha is a member of the Hale family. He's then sent away, and Peter is not as catatonic as we think. Back in detention, we finally get to understand the resentment that Stiles has for Scott.
Look, you have something, Scott. Okay, whether you want it or not, you can do things that nobody else can do. So that means you don't have a choice anymore. It means you have to do something.
For half the season, we've been talking about Stiles' expectations of Scott and his own assumptions of how he would handle being in Scott's position. The delivery of this line is interesting in a few ways. Stiles is finally accepting that he'll never be Scott, so instead he has to do everything he can to convince Scott of his own responsibility. Because they are reflections of each other, Scott also accepts that he can't continue to ignore his responsibility. Again, these characters work best when they rely on each other, when they make a claim, observe each other's actions, and recalibrate. I've said it every episode, and I'll continue to say it. The other part about this line is the question of choice. Stiles says that Scott doesn't get to choose to accept this responsibility. He just has to do it. And that's true. But much of Scott's arc has been about choice and finding a balance between choices. In fact, this episode alone was about trying to find an alternative to Derek's use of anger as control. And in the end, Scott and Stiles find a different way. That's sort of the beauty in how Scott's character grows throughout the show. He rarely settles for just making the lesser evil of two choices. Instead, he always tries to find an alternative. Derek has made quite the conclusion. After a mysterious source snuck him a key piece of evidence, Derek goes after Dr. Deaton, believing that he is the Alpha. I've rewatched this scene a few times and I've managed to connect most of the dots. So Derek's evidence is a document that records a visit to Deaton's office. In that visit, Deaton was shown a deer with a spiral carved into its body. Deaton says he had never seen something like that before, and Derek says he's lying. The spiral, as Derek finally reveals, is a symbol that the Hale Pack uses to mark a quest for revenge. That's why he asked Peter if anyone else had survived the fire, because only a member of the pack would use that symbol. So why would Derek be so confident that Deaton was lying about never seeing that spiral unless he already knew who Deaton was? And if the spiral is only used by members of the pack, then Deaton must be, or have been, part of the Hale Pack. This is something that Derek knows that we don't. And it's why Derek believes Deaton is the Alpha. My only question is, who gave Derek the note? I won't spoil how the season ends, but I've ultimately decided that this is just a plot hole. Just as Derek starts to attack Dr. Deaton, Scott arrives in time to stop him. He's even incensed enough to use the full force of his werewolf strength and shifting back with ease. This display of control even shocks Derek, and forgive me for being dramatic, but I see this moment as the start of Scott forging his own path, of deciding what it means to be a werewolf and what kind of werewolf he is going to be.
We're predators. You don't have to be killers.
But there's still the question of Dr. Deaton. If Derek has credible reason to believe that Deaton is the alpha, Scott still isn't willing to act on that assumption. So his plan involves going to the school and calling the alpha himself. Stiles delivers his usual dose of hypocrisy.
Well, personally, I'm a fan of ignoring a problem until eventually it just goes away. So that means you don't have a choice anymore. It means you have to do something.
And the pair go inside the school in order to use the school's PA system to call the alpha. If Deaton is the alpha, then he'll respond and come after Scott. If it's someone else, then, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
You're calling the alpha, all right? Be a man. Be a werewolf, not a teen wolf. Be a werewolf.
It takes a few tries, but Scott, bless his heart, finally delivers his first wolf howl, or roar. Derek, who didn't know this was the plan, is understandably pissed. But the argument is cut short when... and the episode ends. And that's all I have to say. See you next time when we watch the best episode of Season 1.